visual representation. I'll take a picture. I'll put it in the notes on the website of the different varieties or the different shades of these honey jars here.
Mm-hmm.
Cool. So that brings us to what attracts the bees to these different plants, or what are the pollinators to these different plants? What is driving them to show up at this flower? And
well, the bee doesn't go there just for the heck of it. If it didn't have any nectar or pollen to give the bee, the flower would probably never be, or would still be wind pollinated.
Yeah.
So there's a couple of ways. First, by the color of the flower. Now, bees don't see a flower like we do. They see in many different spectrums other than the light spectrums that we see.
Mm-hmm.
So I am told by bees and bee experts that it looks like a target. If you can picture a flower like a dandelion, for example, that it's just not all yellow, but there's a target there saying that this is the flower that I am, and here, come and get it, and this is where to come. So
it's not really the bee looking at me like, oh man,
oh no,
gorgeous flower.
No, well, it might be. I don't know.
No.
I haven't spoken to many bees about that, but it does identify the flower from the foliage.
Yeah. Okay.
So there's a target there. Now, just like in Halloween, kids wouldn't come around to your doors if there weren't treats to be given out, right?
Mm-hmm.
All right. So the flower has to come up with treats, and it does that in a couple of ways. One, nectar in many cases. And also, and that's used as a sugar source, a fuel, if you will, for the bees and their young. And of course, honeybees, for example, will process that through their stomachs and come up with honey as their source, and it's very concentrated. So they have to visit a lot of flowers in order to get just a little bit of honey. And also the pollen. Now, all the pollen is collected by the bees or the butterflies or the hummingbirds as a pollen source, and it's accidentally left. Pieces of pollen are left on different visitations to different flowers. So a little bit goes to. It's like when you pick blueberries in a U-pick. Mm-hmm. Some for me, some for the basket. Okay, that's the way it goes.
Oh, I got you. Gotcha. Maybe some on the ground for the birds.
No.
Avoid that.
Okay, and then other plants provide, and this is really weird. Some plants just give you accommodations. The skunk cabbage, for example. When do skunk cabbages come up? Early spring, March.
Yeah,
the ground still may be frozen. They're the first up, but actually their metabolism, the same sulfur compounds that give it its weird scent, also produce warmth. And so when the flower for the skunk cabbage comes out of the ground, what it does is it heats up the ground and actually provides a little warm cabin for those early bird insects to go in, mostly flies. But that's how the skunk cabbage attracts them to pollinate that flower. And then maybe the next day they're in another flower. And maybe the next day they're in another flower so that they pollinate different flowers, and then maybe there's a spider in the fifth one, and the spider has to eat too. So, yeah. Well, if I was a spider, that'd be smart to hang out in a skunk cabbage, right?
Yeah, I don't know if that's a place I'd want to hang out. It doesn't sound too appealing, except for the warmth.
The warmth, you take your chances. And then one final example is the possibility of finding a mate. Many of tropical orchids, believe it or not, have structures in the flower that look like a bee. I mean, and if you look at an orchid, you can almost see that. And according to the bee eyesight, it looks like a female might be there. And he just goes into that flower and starts, it's kind of a bee blow-up doll, I guess.
Okay.
And finding out, well, this is not real. But in the meantime, he's
in there collecting pollen
yeah.
Depositing pollen.
That's right.
And
so, I mean, there's a lot of tricks to the trade, evidently, and I'm sure there's many, many more, but those are a few that I'm aware of.
Yeah, not a reproductive process for the bee, but the plant is getting its pollen for the
has to attract. Yeah, and it's happened over millions and millions of years, and these are the tricks that have worked the best, and they still work the best. The kids still come for Halloween. Well, let's not go any farther than that.
Yeah, we'll leave it there. So anyway, what are the types of pollinators we have. We've been talking about the honeybee.
Yep.
And a little bit of some other varieties of bees, but that's not 100% of what's pollinating our plants.
No. Of the animal pollinated plants, the honeybee, which most people think is the predominant pollinator out there, well, it can be, and it is for major crops out there like apples, and blueberries, and pumpkins, and almonds, for example. There is a billion-dollar business out there of raising bees in hives, delivering them to orchards at the time of flowering so that the flowers can be pollinated, and then putting them back on a truck. And now we're talking about thousands of hives, because we're talking about thousands of acres of almonds, for example.
Yeah.
And if they're not pollinated, the farmer doesn't get any fruit, and then he doesn't get paid.
Yeah, and honeybees, I read, are preferred because of their ability, after they're done working all day, they come back to the hive, and then they can be easily transported to the next farm. Mm-hmm. Sometimes, from California, almond trees, or the almond, we'll call it, is it a grove? I don't know. Almond farm.
Orchard.
Orchard. Yeah. Almond orchard in California, and then brought east to Michigan or up to Washington or Connecticut for our spring flowering and spring fertilization for all our fall harvest.
Most of the time it's south to north, because that's the progression of flowers. Yeah, think of a honeybee as a good, dependable husband. Goes to work, comes home.
Right.
Goes to work, comes home. Think of a native honeybee, a native bee as kind of a biker. A biker goes to work and works hard, and then he may go to this bar or that bar. I mean, of course, I'm stereotyping here, but he may go to the reservoir with his buddies. You never know where he's going to end up.
Sure.
But you never know when he's going to get there.
Yeah.
But he works very hard during the day, and he's a rough and tumble type of guy.
Yeah. So I did read that the honeybees, being the preferred pollinator, they've tried so many ways to augment and find some sort of manufactured way to pollinate these orchards, and nothing has come close to the efficiency and effectiveness of the bee.
That's right.
Like, they tried everything up to basically loading a shotgun cartridge with pollen and shooting it out into the orchard. And nothing has worked. Even coating the orchard with pollen, and it's just not working because of the thousands and thousands of plants a single bee will travel to within one day.
Right. Well, we think we're pretty smart, but this has been going on for a long, long time, Terry.
You can't beat 100 million years of experience.
I can't imagine what 100 million years is. That's more fingers than I have.
Right. And we've only been celebrating for 12. Look at us.
That's right.
Oh, man.
So we have different relationships. The honeybees, so they're big on the commercial scale, but around the backyard, if you're lucky to have a guy like Mr. Shooks in the neighborhood, well, you may get some of his bees to come over, and hopefully you do. But the native pollinators have been here for a long time. When you think that the pollen of the honeybees are European in origin, and they were brought here by the colonists. The American Indian had raised corn, pumpkins, beans, and a few other things. Of course, there's a lot of plants here that need pollinating that they actually went out into the woods and foraged. But they were doing just fine without the honeybees. And why? Because they had native pollinators that had developed over those 100 million years with those plants, and maybe had specific or unspecific pollinating responsibilities and tendencies. Also, there's butterflies. There are hummingbirds for those trumpet-shaped flowers. A hummingbird, especially in the tropics, we only have one hummingbird here. That must be my lawyer.
It's the Growing Home hotline.
It is. Hello? Yes, you won. Thank you. All right. So anyway, where was I? Yes, the
hummingbirds.
The hummingbirds. The hummingbirds are predominantly in the tropic. We only have one species of hummingbird here in the United States, east of the Mississippi, and that's the ruby-throated hummingbird.
Right.
And it will feed on most trumpet-shaped flowers, anything from the tiniest to the biggest. But it accumulates pollen on its beak and its forehead, and that's how it transfers pollen. So it works well there.
Fascinating. And Len, I have a joke for you.
You do?
I do. What superpower does a hummingbird have?
Don't know.
They can see into the fuchsia.
Okay, getting on, Terry here. How you?
That's a homegrown joke right there.
I guess so.
Yeah, too many hours in the garden center.
But then we have the bumblebees. We have flies. There's a number of plants, especially native plants, that are pollinated by flies, and that grosses people out. But the pawpaw, which is a native tree, is pollinated by flies. Skunk cabbage by flies. There's a myriad of plants out there that have distasteful scents that attract flies. Of course, there's the mason bee and the squash bee, which are very specialized for those plants. But and beetles, there are a number of beetles that are out there that will pollinate, and some of these insects are so small that you have no idea they're there. You're overlooking them, and the bee and the bumblebee, they're big enough you can see them, and they're slow enough so you can see them. But there's a lot, tens of thousands of beetles and flies and insects that are out there that you won't even notice. And the thing is, there's such a relationship on any one flower. You not only have the bees collecting the insects collecting honey, but the smart predator wasp, the smart predator will hang around these flowers because they're attracting their prey. So there's a big circle, a big web of action going there. Now, I got to tell you a story about. We talked about the bees. If you look at a honeybee, okay, just observe how it lands on a flower. It's like a ballet dancer. The prima donna. It comes in, it floats in slowly, and it kind of lights on a flower, and it does it so delicately, and then goes in, sips the nectar, and takes the pollen and puts it on its little sacs on its legs, and then will take off and move to another flower, and it does this so gracefully. Yeah. And if you watch, we'll say a mason bee or a squash bee, they are different than the honeybees because they're covered with hairs. They're really hairy. I mean, they're like me, they got hair all over their back. But anyway, they'll come into a flower and they'll actually do a belly flop, and they just go on the pollen. They collect their pollen on their bodies, and then that's why they're especially very effective. They're fast and they're deliberate, but they collect it on their bodies so they can spread the pollen a lot faster. And they go ahead and they sip the nectar, and at the end of the day or at the end of the hour, whatever time lunchtime is, they go back to their little hive. Or nest, I guess it's called, because native bees don't have hives and they don't produce honey, right? Like the honeybees do.
Most of them live in the ground, correct?
That's right. Yeah. They're called solitary bees for a reason. They have young, but and they have a boyfriend, maybe. But most of the time, they live their lives pretty much as a hermit. Wow. In the ground, and that's why cultivating the soil can tend to disrupt this because let's say the squash bee builds its nest in the squash field or the pumpkin field, very close by the plants. Yep. And what do you do the first thing in the spring with the pumpkin field?
Till your soil.
Yeah, till your soil. So you're destroying the nest. So a lot of times I talk to a pumpkin grower, a commercial pumpkin grower, and he says, it's very difficult to use the same field twice in a row. And I'm wondering whether this has anything to do with it. But that's neither here nor there.
Yeah. So we have our prima donnas, the honeybees.
The honeybees, and then I look at the natives as bulldozers. I mean, these are the get to work guys. And the honeybee he gets up she gets up, excuse me, they're all she's. They get up a little bit late. They have their coffee. They go to the spa. And then when it's warm enough, They go to work.
Yeah.
Okay. As a result, and then when it's rainy and the weather's not so good, well,
they stay home.
Yeah, or they don't visit many flowers at all.
Huh.
Whereas the